read?
Not that one. I do the audiobooks. I'm too lazy to read.
So last time we're looking at our good dead friend, John Stuart Mill, talking about liberty. And he's presenting what might be considered sort of the more liberal view of liberty, as opposed to the view we saw from the dead guy Mussolini, which presented the fascist view. Now, we saw last time that Mill was looking at the question of how much of our business, roughly speaking, is the business of others. And he ran through a bit of like quick history about this. And then we pick up with sort of the core part of his theory. Now, once we get to a situation where you have a democracy, where you have the elected officials being drawn from the people and being voted for by the people, it may be tempting to say, well, then we don't have to worry about the oppression of the state anymore because the state is the people, and the people wouldn't oppress themselves. So problem solved. But as Mill points out, there is a problem. First, there is what's known as the will of the people. All politicians, of course, claim to be exercising the will of the people. But Mill notes that the will of the people is not typically, in fact almost never, the will of everybody, but it's the will of, at best, the majority of people, or the people who are the loudest, or who claim to be the majority. So his concern is that even if you have government, of the people, by the people, for the people, some, the majority, may wish to engage in tyranny. And it is a very clever phrase, the tyranny of the majority. And the concern is that the majority might decide, because they're the majority, and they have the power to do so, to oppress or mistreat the numerical minorities. And so his concern is, how do you protect numerical minorities from the tyranny of the majority? And what is the worry? Well, his concern is that people may be, the majority may impose on everyone else, its own ideas and practices. It may limit, people's development that doesn't match their views. And essentially, the overall sort of concern is the majority would make everyone be like them. And so his concern is with that particular problem, which is a problem in democratic states. Now, in order to solve this problem, he looks at the question of, so everyone wants to get in everybody's business, well, almost everybody. And so the question is, legitimately, how much of my business, how much of your business is the business of other people? How much of your business is my business? How much of my business is your business? Now, Mill notes and presents what could be called the paradox of liberty. And it'll first sound something like from the book 1984, that war is peace, ignorance is knowledge, that type of stuff. And he claims that liberty, freedom, requires restricting freedom, which again sounds, freedom requires lack of freedom. It would seem to be, again, like a 1984, slogan of a tyrant. But in this case, he's actually right. How so? Well, we can look at it, in terms of the theory, going back to our good dead friend, Tommy Hobbes. Hobbes noted that if everyone has a right to all things, then in fact there's a right to nothing. And so, but to use, some concrete examples, in order for you to have the right to express yourself, other people have to be limited in their ability to silence you. In order for you to have the right to your property, to your stuff, other people have to be denied the right to take your stuff. To have a right to life, other people have to be denied the right to murder. And so, he's right. In order to be free, other people have to be restrained from impinging on you. So freedom requires limits on freedom. Now, of course, in Mill's case, he's talking about where this is really actually true, but you have to be wary of people who say such things and they just want to get rid of freedom. So how do we tell? How do we decide, since Mill rests on, the assumption that freedom requires limiting freedom. But then the question arises, so how much should we be limiting people's freedom? And going back to my analogy, you can think of it as sort of like being in a bad way to look at it, like being in a cage, a nice way of being like in a preserve or your own fortress, so to speak. So the question is, how narrow should that be? Now, Mill presents what is a typical problem with this, namely that most people regard their own views as self-evident, not requiring any argument, and they simply go by their own opinions. They basically think, well, this is roughly put, what I want people to do is to do what I like, I want them to do, and I want them to not do what I don't want them to do. But as Mill notes, most people don't operate on an actual consistent principle beyond the principle of, which is really not a principle, I want people to do what I want them to do, but I want to forbid them from doing what I want to forbid them to do. And well, to illustrate this, that people typically go by their terms of what they want the government to do, they go by their sentiments, their feeling that particular matter, rather than a consistent principle. We can take some real world examples. And to be fair and balanced, I'll use both, the left, the liberals and Democrats, and the right, conservatives, Republicans. Now, well, let's first begin with Republicans. Now, one thing that both Democrats and Republicans are concerned about is, say, local autonomy. What should, say, city, town, county governments be allowed to restrict, forbid, and allow? Now, typically the Republicans will say, if a small town or county wants to do something they like, they'll say local government. You shouldn't have, the state government or the federal government imposing on that. And it would seem to be endorsing a principle of, local autonomy. But recently, in many states, localities have said, we don't really want people fracking in our, town, in our county, because of all the problems. And so some, towns, et cetera, counties started passing laws saying no fracking. So what did our state legislature, other state legislators do? Well, they said they passed a law saying that localities can't do that. And so that doesn't seem to be a consistent principle, because if the principle is local government should have autonomy, they should have autonomy in things that the Republicans like and things that they don't like. And so it's a good example of what Mill's talking about. It's not a consistent principle. Now, on the side of the Democrats, we can pick on the liberals now. One thing that, kind of an interesting argument on the moral topic of abortion, and you can kind of link that to the issue of, say, hunting. Because for the most part, not always, but many liberals are pro-choice, but often anti-hunting. Not always, this is not, just like with Republicans, there are some Republicans who staunchly defend, local rights. And what a person might say is, well, what's a consistent principle? Well, you might say, well, the principle here is it's okay to, well, with hunting, you shouldn't kill innocent creatures. Hunting meat is murder. And then some might say, well, what about abortion? Isn't that killing innocent creatures? And you might say, well, they don't like, if you want to be stereotype liberals, you might say they don't like guns, but they're okay with this. And then you'd say, well, where is the consistency? Because if killing innocent creatures is wrong, it's wrong. And if it's okay when we need to do so, then it's okay when we need to do so. And so Mill seems to be right. You could run through all the politics where people have a position based on what they like, and then a position that's totally inconsistent with that. So Mill, being a philosopher, thinks people should be consistent. They should have a principle about how much business the state should get into. So, for example, if someone believes the state should let you exercise the right to, shouldn't get in business when it comes to like guns or regulating industry, then the government shouldn't get in your business when it comes to regulating your sexuality. That would be consistent. If you have a position of, government shouldn't get in your business, it shouldn't get into your business. So Mill thinks that operating by no principle is problematic, because philosopher. So what's his principle? Well, he presents the generally well-accepted principle of harm. And the idea is this. As he sees it, suppose you are trying to decide how much the state, or anybody, should get into your business. And the principle of harm is this. the only thing that justifies us impeding the liberty of another is that doing so would prevent that person from harming others. This idea is basically the only way to justify it is preventing harm to others. So what about cases, well, to give an example, if a person wants to like murder people or silence people or do other awful things to people, then Mill would say, well, that becomes our business. If someone's trying to kill you, that is your business. Or if they want to sell you tainted food that can harm you, that becomes your business. Now what about things that would be beneficial to the person to be made to do, like eat better, exercise more? Or about things that are bad for a person, that being forbidden from doing them would be better for their well-being, like being forbidden from using tobacco, alcohol, drugs, Twinkies, all those dangerous substances. Well, Mill says, if it only affects the person, then it's not our business. We have no right to restrict or limit them, because it's not harming us. Do we have a right to try to persuade them, convince them that it's a bad idea, or a stupid idea? Well, Mill says, sure. We have every right to try to persuade people, but we have no right to compel them. So, to use an illustration, suppose you get someone who wants to sit in their parents' basement playing Destiny or Halo 5 on their Xbox One, and they just want to drink and smoke marijuana and tobacco and eat Twinkies and Cheetos all day. Well, Mill would say, not a good life choice, and we should probably try to persuade them to cut back on those Twinkies and Cheetos and maybe get out once in a while. But as long as they stay in their basement and they're not hurting anyone, we have no right to compel them, to force them to not do that. But if they leave the basement and they're totally drunk or high and they want to get in a car and drive around or operate on people in surgery, then it becomes our business, so because they can hurt us. So if someone wants to get drunk and drive their motorcycle around in their house and wreck their whole house, as long as they stay within their house and they're not hurting us, we would say, that's stupid, stop doing that. But we'd have no right to arrest them or stop them. Now, the challenge then becomes, and Mill kind of briefly addresses this, is how do we define that circle of harm in terms of, is something hurting others or not? And I'll give two illustrations. One is this. Take, for example, same-sex marriage. One argument as to why you shouldn't restrict same-sex marriage is because, well, if a couple down the street is same-sex and you're married, that doesn't affect your marriage at all. It doesn't, it's not like your husband or wife is going to go, I now hate you because, Bob and Todd got married, so I cannot be married to you anymore. I mean, maybe a person would do that, but that would be pretty insane. Now, what people do argue, though, is that it does actually harm others. For example, some of the stock arguments are that it harms people's marriages, degrades the value of marriage, it's bad for children, and what they're trying to do is a, rational tactic. Because if it doesn't hurt anybody at all, it doesn't hurt other people, it's not our business. But if it does harm others, then it becomes our business. So if Todd and Bob being married actually hurts your marriage and cause you to get divorced, then you might say, well, they're actually harming you, so you have a stake in that. Another example, take, we'll go on the liberal side. One thing people complain about is, on the right, complaining about liberals, is Obamacare. We're having another vote to try to get rid of that. Now, one argument against the insurance is this. It's that if a person wants to go around without insurance, and they get they're riding a motorcycle without a helmet, which is another choice, and they get hit by a car, who does that hurt? Hurt them, a whole bunch, a whole bunches. And you might say, well, that was a poor choice, they should have insurance, but it's their choice. It only affects them. But one of the arguments for requiring people to get insurance is this. If you get someone riding a motorcycle and they have no insurance and they get busted up and they go to the emergency room and they can't pay for it, someone's got to pay for it. Because hospitals are required by law, they just can't say, sorry, which is a good thing. They just can't let people, toss people out because they can't pay. But someone's got to pay for that. That's the way stuff works, at least under our system. So if, Joe gets busted up and can't afford his bill, who ultimately pays for it? We do. Anybody who's got insurance, part of your insurance premium costs are paying for people who don't have insurance. And the estimates vary, but the one I saw, which could be totally accurate now, but the last one I saw, like I think a year or 2 or 3 ago, was the average family of 4, I think. It costs them like an extra $1,200 a year, just paying into that. So if everyone had insurance, in theory, that would save them, it's not like a huge amount of money, but $1,200 that's some nice stuff.
It's not the more people you have on your plan, then less it is, right?
Yeah, but also the fact is, if people who are insured get busted up and they can't pay, we gotta pay for that. And part of our premiums go into paying for.
Healthcare should be free.
Someone's gotta pay for it. That's one of the things is there's no such thing as a free lunch because someone's gotta make that lunch and deliver it. The question, of course, is who should pay for it. So you could argue that hurts other people because if Bob gets busted up and he can't pay, then I gotta pay, and that's money coming out of my pocket, not of your pocket. And so he is hurting other people. And so then it becomes a very practical question. When does stuff hurt other people, when doesn't? And, practical challenge is working out that and how much it becomes our business. Some would say, well, yeah, it only costs you $1,200 a year, so it's not your business. And other people would say, $1,200, it is my business. That's, if I'm paying for Bob being busted up, Bob better get himself some insurance. Or people use the same argument to argue that we should have, as you said, national health insurance. It should be something you get just for being a citizen, like in Canada and other countries. Now, he does consider 2 limits on this principle of liberty. Because again, his view is basically the only thing that justifies us getting people's business is to prevent harm to others. The person's only hurting themselves. We can say, hey, that's kind of stupid, but we have no right to stop them. And here are the exceptions. First one is what we could call the incompetent, namely, children and those who are not, he says in need of care, but people who aren't competent adults. And I can put it as a question. Should kids have the liberty to go and get heroin and strippers and alcohol and cars? Yeah, children. 10-year-olds. No, because why? Why shouldn't the kids be getting the heroin? They might need some heroin. You don't know what they need.
Their bodies can't handle it.
Yeah, it could be like a health thing, Of course, adult bodies can't handle heroin too well either. But yeah, they're kids. They're not good at making decisions. Well, actually, kids are. Actually, what's interesting is people often think that children are just bad decision makers, that they're like irrational. What it turns out is apparently they make decisions the same way adults do. The main difference is that when you're a teenager, the receptors in your brain that handle dopamine and endorphin, stuff feeling good, the receptors are really good. So doing stuff that's pleasurable feels like really great. And as you get older, so the lesson is enjoy things while it lasts, those receptors get weaker. So when you're an adult, you're still making decisions the same way. It's just doing stuff doesn't feel as good. It's like when you're a kid doing like the crazy thing, like let's go out and drive real fast in the car and throw eggs at people and toilet paper houses. That feels really awesome, even though you think, oh, this could be trouble. But the reward is so great. But then when you get older, you're like, I just don't enjoy stuff that much.
Yeah, do like experience and curiosity.
Yeah, it all goes. So the lesson is, every passing year, life becomes less enjoyable. So you ever wonder, like old people are grumpy? That's why they're grumpy, because they literally cannot enjoy life anymore. True. So enjoy it now, because you're going to lose that. So literally, these are the most enjoyable times of your life. Now, one final point, unless you think it's like, oh God, it's all going to go wrong. Apparently, older people claim to be happier. They don't experience pleasure as much, but they claim to be happier. Maybe it's because when you're that old, you're like, I just don't care at that point. So kids will often, make poor decisions, and so we need to protect them from that. And people who are not competent at being adults, same thing. They can't make, informed decisions. Which of course does lead to an interesting question. What if someone always is free to make the bad choice, but they always choose badly? And so it's kind of a thing that a person might kind of disqualify themselves, because if they make bad choices, they're clearly not competent in making choices. So to be free to make bad choices, you'd have to be such that you would not make such choices. Now, Mill's next application is classic British. The idea that, well, here's his idea. If you have a civilization, a country, etc., in which the people are in a barbarous state, they're not, to be properly English, so to speak. If the ruler of that country is filled with the spirit of uplifting them, and the ruler is actually, not just like pretending to, but really lifting them up, then his view is that liberty is not applicable there. But once he says they're uplifted to the proper level, then liberty would be applicable. And the reason why I say this is very British is because if you go back and look at the colonial age, the infamous, white man's burden, the idea was that the Brits would bring civilization to other people, and they would run the show until those people were able to run their own show. And we were doing the same thing. When we took over Iraq and Afghanistan, we said to them, when you're able to run your country, we'll give it back to you. Or when we become tired of paying for it, then we'll give it back to you. So I was right about that. Should the barbarians be denied liberty? Well, it certainly is arrogance for the Brits or us to say we're better than other people, so they can't handle, we even see people say this today, some people can't handle democracy. It's like, well, probably no one can, because, or we all can. But interesting form. Just a bit imperialistic. Now, the foundation for all this for Mill is utility. Going back to the ancient days of Part 2, Mill utilitarian, that didn't change. So one potential problem with this, of course, is if we base it not on, say, a natural right. For Locke, you get life, liberty, and property. So the justification for Locke, well, ultimately for Locke, it's God. He's behind all of that. But you have a natural right to liberty that is presumably eternally protected. But if you base it on utility, the argument is essentially this. Mill argues that, well, if we take, all the happiness generated by letting people have this liberty, and not compelling them, except when they're harming others, and then we compare that to the unhappiness that would be created by, not allowing that, he says that the happiness of allowing people liberty, he creates more happiness than, allowing people their liberty creates more happiness than unhappiness, so in principle utility, the right thing. Now, one potential problem is this is kind of a contingent thing. So if it turned out that the opposite was true, that having people be free created more unhappiness than happiness, then liberty would be wrong. We should then, essentially it's like Mussolini's argument. We'd have to go and ensure that people are only as free as they can handle. So one of the weak points that always occurs in utilitarian calculations is if things change a bit, the numbers you get them wrong in the first place, or there was more change in the situation, more unhappiness than happiness, then it would now be bad. Now some might say, well, that's fine. If people being free made people miserable, then being free would be bad. Maybe it's better to be unfree and happy than free and sad. Sad freedom. That sounds like a good book title. Sad freedom. Copyright. Actually, I don't think there's copyright titles. I'll just put it on a t-shirt and trademark it. Trademark. Now, he considers three other considerations. One is, of course, is punishment. Punishment typically involves depriving people of liberty, locking them up, harming them, taking their money. Now, he justifies this on utilitarian grounds. So we can, the question might be, well, people should be free, well, how can we lock them up or punish them? And his answer again is essentially utility. That justifies it. Now what about compelling people to perform positive services. For example, I don't know if this is still true, but when I was a college freshman, I had to register for selective service to get my federal money, my Pell Grant. Still true? Did you have to prove selective service?
I'm not sure.
Better check on that. We're heading towards another war. And look that up. And of course, people have jury duty. They send you the jury duty summons, which I get then, another few months, be getting another one, I'm sure. Just had one in September, so yeah, about a year, so next September. So the idea is they can compel you to do that. And of course, it takes away your liberty. Now, Mill's argument for that, again, is essentially utility. Yes, being compelled to go and serve on a jury, or being compelled to engage in military service, he thinks that does infringe your liberty, but again, justified by utility. The last thing he considers here is accountability. Essentially it's the same sort of issue we saw when I mentioned some of the cases, and one of the cases being obligations to others. Now, as Mill notes, it's well accepted, and reasonably so, that it's okay to prevent people from doing evil stuff. The idea being, if you ask people intuitively, is it okay to hold people accountable for evil stuff they do, like murdering and stealing? And generally the intuitive view would be yes. Now, what about cases where someone is not doing bad, they're just not preventing bad? They are like a bystander. They see if someone gets stabbed, and they don't join in the stabbing, but they don't stop it, or they don't even call it in. And that, of course, is an interesting moral problem. Do we have an obligation to help others? Now, Mill gives the following answer. Utility, of course. So you do the weighing, and the way he kind of works it out is, he says, well, we need to consider the following two factors. One is this. If somebody is more likely to act better than if they would, better on their own than they would if they were being compelled, then we should, according to him, let them have that freedom. Secondly, if the attempt to control them would create more harm than benefits, we shouldn't do that either. Now, what could be an example of this, where not compelling someone would be better than compelling them? Well, here's one possible illustration. Now, as you probably know, Bernie Sanders running for president, or the Clinton running for president, and one of their proposals is taxing the rich more. And the idea, of course, is tax the rich more, and you can use the money for social programs. Bernie, for example, is proposing taxing the top earners and using that money to provide essentially financial aid for schools. And he's talking about free college. But again, of course, there's nothing free. It's just that someone else would be paying for it. Now, one argument people give against forcing the rich to do that is this. So the idea would be, okay, if we make them tax them more, and we give the money to students, doing that social good. But one of the arguments is if we tax the rich more, they'll stop giving to charitable organizations. They'll just, either because they don't have money, supposedly, or they'll just out of perhaps, spite or something. And the claim is, the argument is that this would be worse, because whatever we gain by taxing them more, we would lose. So they would give less to charity. And so you might get X amount of dollars for taxing them more, but you may lose 2x from the charitable donations. And so the argument would be we shouldn't compel people to do that because they would do better if they weren't compelled. Or so goes the argument. And so Mill again appeals to utility. We can hold people accountable, but only when doing so would not be worse than not doing so. And so it's kind of a practical problem. How do you decide whether people would behave better if left alone, or it's better to compel? Last few things from Mill. What about our spheres of action and regions of liberty? Well, he considers 3 areas of freedom. which he considers essential to being free. First one is this, the inward domain of consciousness, freedom of thought. Now currently, can the government impose on our freedom of thought? Can they make you think things or not think things? Well, unless they get some sort of secret mind control, probably no. I mean, of course, they can influence us, through propaganda, etc. But we seem to have that freedom. Now, Mill also includes here not just the freedom to think, but also the freedom of expression, which he considers tied to that. So, we, of course, in the United States, have the legal First Amendment right to free expression, but Mill also considers it a moral right to express yourself. Now, he's right about that. Should we be free to express our views?
Yes.
What if our views are offensive to people?
Freedom of speech.
What if it's hate speech?
Well, your light ends where someone else's begins. So.
True, I mean, you could argue that it's something that is actually creating real harm to someone, and not just they feel annoyed by it. You could argue that that would be, like things like death threats, etc., would be covered. Second region, tastes and pursuits. Essentially, people living the life they wish to live. Now, Mill says there shouldn't be law, unless the tastes and pursuits involve things that harm other people, like someone wants to be like a cannibal or something. But as long as it doesn't hurt other people, Mill's view is that people should be allowed to do that, should not be forbidden. Now, he does raise the important sort of condition, namely that this is subject to the consequences. Because his view is there should be no restriction on things that don't harm people, but of course, there is the practical thing that taste and pursuits and choices can have consequences that affect someone. Well, to use a kind of extreme example, but one that works, some people are into heavy body modifications. One example is having like acrylic, windows put into the cheeks so you can see what people are chewing. And some people go way beyond that. For example, these are really extreme cases. There's a person who had like, kind of like horns and stuff put in, and their skin, made to look sort of like a lizard skin, and contacts, etc. And so, and it's all within the existing tech. I mean, they don't have like lizard powers or anything. I guess that'd be kind of cool. They just kind of look like a lizard or whatever. And you could say, well, yeah, people should be able to do all that stuff. Mill would say, yeah, as long as it's not hurting other people, fine. But of course, there are consequences. So the person goes and wants to get a job at like a bank, for example, and they say, well, we need a non-lizard sort of person working as a teller. In that case, we'd say, well, that would be a potential consequence. And even though the person has the right to do that, other people would have the right in those cases to, which of course does leave the question of, what kind of tastes and pursuits can we, what sort of consequences should we accept? So I guess if someone wants to look like a lizard, the bank may be able to say, we need a different sort of look. But what if a person is, and this is where it becomes much more controversial, what if a person is biologically male but likes to wear a nice, dress? Could the bank be able to say, well, we need our guys to dress as guys? Mm-hmm. And then you might say, well, that might be a harm. But then, of course, lizard man could say, but I'm a lizard at heart. You're denying me my lizarddom. And then we get into debates about, what sort of things are legitimate consequences and what kind of things are actual harms to people. Lastly, the liberty of combination, the right of people to group together, as long as they're not being coerced or tricked by fraud. To close, Mill notes that, he's writing in the 1800s, but he notes that the current trends tend to oppose liberty, that leaning towards ever greater restrictions. He does note in the case of the ancient commonwealths, thinking of perhaps, for example, a place like Sparta or Athens, that such control over people's lives might have been justifiable, given the circumstances. In the case of modern commonwealths, he believes that it's not justified, because essentially his concern is that what he calls, in a nice phrase, the engines of moral repression are very busy trying to restrict people in what they can and cannot do. And he thinks the general tendency is against liberty. Now, he's writing, of course, in the 1800s, but a good question would be, what about today? Is he right? Is there a general tendency towards limiting liberty, expanding it, or is it just kind of staying steady? Well, in some cases, we might have more liberty. For example, we can point to laws, states that have started legalizing marijuana. You might say that's more freedom. Or when they have, same-sex marriage being legal now, more freedom. But then you might say, well, there's other areas where it's, kind of restrictive. For example, people or gun owners would point to, the laws against guns, piling up over the years. Also, people who are against same-sex marriage would say, well, that's restricting their religious freedom, their liberty to express their dislike of other people's liberty. And if we look at all of the impositions, like to keep us safe, we could say that those are closing down liberty as well. Another example would be, well, I mentioned either in this class, maybe in another class, about how one of the concerns is some schools now have free speech zones. And kind of a common reply to that is, well, all areas should be free speech zones because, First Amendment type of stuff. And so there's a concern that there's restrictions on liberty of expression, either put like in actual rules or by social behavior. And, final closing example would be when people are on social media and they say things other people don't like, there's often just a firestorm of attacks against them to silence them. And even though that's not, the government imposing, it is, people imposing the liberty of others. And going back to the point about, do you have the right to express things that offend people? And there's an ever-increasing tendency to think that we shouldn't do that, to restrict offensive language. But then you get into the question of, where does it offensive cross over to criminal threatening? Which is a good question. So that brings us to the end of the liberty section, which appropriately enough is the end of the class. And so now you have liberty from the class. Well, at least liberty potentially once you get all the stuff done.